Hello and welcome back to part 5, which really will be the final part this time of this audiobook guide series that I've been doing on my channel. Part 1, I spoke about how to get into audiobook reading. Part 2, I spoke about where to get your audiobooks from. Part 3 was how to maximize the time that you spend reading, how to incorporate reading into more parts of your day. Part 4, I gave you some recommendations of audiobooks to listen to when you're starting out getting used to audiobook reading. And then this part 5, is going to be some more advanced audiobook recommendations if you feel like you're ready to take that step into reading the slightly more challenging books. And these particular recommendations are where I think the audiobook actually makes the read easier as opposed to more difficult. So, I mean, I feel that way about all audiobooks, but these in particular really strike me as books that help ease what would otherwise potentially be a little bit of a difficult reading experience. So, my first recommendation is going to be Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. So I have read the first 4 of these and I have been reading them all on audio. I was telling you in part 4 where I was getting these audiobooks from as I was reading them, so I'm going to do the same here. And these I am accessing via my library, so through the Libby app. And once again, these are narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, who I mentioned in part 4 and I will mention again in this particular video, are fantastic narrators. They really bring the story to life and they make things much easier to follow. I feel like these books can be a little on the dry side, a little bit on the slow side, a little bit on the heavy exposition side, very descriptive, sometimes a bit repetitive, and so I just find that reading these via audio makes my experience much more enjoyable and much easier than reading physically would. Honestly, I don't think I'd even try to read these just physically. I wouldn't get through it, I don't think. And I have tried doing some immersion reading with this series, which I do like, but again, I couldn't read the whole series or even a whole book through the immersion method. It would just be too much for me, I think. But I do think that reading Wheel of Time via audio is easier than reading it physically. The next one I'm going to mention is The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison, which is a standalone, well, it was a standalone fantasy when I read it, but there is a sequel out now, but it's not really a sequel, it's a companion. So I don't know, it's kind of a standalone, but kind of not. I don't really know, but either way, when I read it, it was a standalone, and I did borrow this one from the library as well, and it was definitely an excellent way to go. The narrator was very good, but that's not particularly the reason why. The thing with The Goblin Emperor is that there are lots of very long fantasy words. One that really sticks in my mind is the Unsailor Court, which is just a mouthful, and it's a page full as well. It takes up so much space on a page, and I started reading it physically, this book, and I already sub-vocalize when I'm reading, and I already labour over the words and sounding them out in my head, so it was just gonna be so slow for me to read this book physically, and I just could not get my brain to want to read all of these really long, unwieldy fantasy words and terms. And so reading this one via audio was a complete game changer. I don't think I'd have finished this book without, and I actually did really enjoy the book. And the other thing about audiobook reading for me is that I have found that I prefer if I can read a book in a smaller period of time. So I used to think that it was that I just only liked fast-paced books, but what I'm actually discovering, and I recently spoke about this in a video over on Joanna's channel, Joanna Souza, I will link it down below. It was a Book Dragons Babble episode about slow-paced versus fast-paced books, and I always thought that I was a fast-paced book kind of girl, but actually I don't think I am. I think I like slow books better. It's just that I need to read them within a shorter space of time. And that's a big part of the reason why I read on audio so much, because it's so much easier. And with a book like The Goblin Emperor, that was even more the case. So I do recommend this goes for all of these. I recommend these books just generally, but in particular, I recommend these on audio, and particularly this one. I think audio is the way to go. The next one I want to recommend is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, one of my absolute favourites from last year. I was so nervous to read this book because it's so long, and I've heard... I like long books, but it was more so the fact that it's long, and I'd heard that it was very slow and boring. And the simple fact of the matter is that it is slow, and I can see why people would think that it's boring. Not a whole lot of stuff happens. You're really just with the characters and with the characters' feelings and what is going on for them internally, and there's not a whole lot happening externally. You don't think. You get to the end and you kind of see the pieces coming together, and more has been happening than you actually gave the book credit for. But I think all of those things together mean that it's the kind of book that you probably don't want to drag out over a long period of time in terms of when you're reading it. Now, I know some people have done that and still loved it, like Leanna from Leanna's Library, but for example, Reagan from Peruse Project, she did that. She had it as her commute book, same as Leanna, and Reagan didn't like it, whereas Leanna did. So it really does depend on who you are as a reader, but for me personally, I'm glad that I listened to it on audio because it meant that I was able to read it quickly, which meant that I loved it. And I think if I had read it slowly, i.e. if I had read it physically, I would not have loved it. I probably would have DNF'd it. The next one that I want to talk about falls into this category for a very similar reason, and that is Magician by Raymond E. Feist. So once again, this is a fantasy story, and this one is slightly more classic fantasy in style. It wasn't written super long ago, I don't think, late 80s, early 90s, but it still has that slightly more classic fantasy feel to it. There are two versions that I've been able to find of the narration. I listened to so Magician is kind of split into two books, and I listened to part one on Scribed. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell I listened to via my library, by the way. But I think I'm going to get it on Audible because I really loved it and I probably want to reread it at some point. Anyway, so I listened to part one of Magician on Scribed, and then I listened to part two on Libby. I can't really remember why I did that, but I did. I think it was because of the speed controls. I wanted to have the slightly more sensitive speed controls that's available on Libby as opposed to Scribed. Anyway, so they had two different narrators, which was a little bit weird. I wouldn't necessarily recommend, unless you're super not bothered, swapping narrator halfway through a book. It's the first and only time I've ever done that. It didn't bother me too much, but it was a bit strange. And both narrators, though, were very good, so I suppose the positive is that I can give feedback on both narrators, and they're both great narrators, both very good production quality with these audiobooks. And once again, it's a little bit of a slower story. There's a lot of time jumps that happen, and I do think that as a result of all of that, audio reading is a good way to go, basically for the exact same reasons as I gave for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. But again, as with all of these, it's a much more complicated story, and so that's why it's in the advanced category as opposed to the beginner category. And then the last recommendation I want to give is going to come as no surprise whatsoever. It's a whole series and I love it. I have read it multiple times. I constantly am wanting to reread it, and that is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, Rhythm of War, and the future 5th book, which will be coming to us soon, and I'm very excited. I have read all of them multiple times. I think I've read the first three 3 times and I've read Rhythm of War twice. And I just think that they're fantastic audiobooks. Once again, Michael Kramer, Kate Redding, fantastic narrators. They bring so much to the story. I feel like it's just a whole experience in and of itself. And again, they're long. It's not that they're slow, it's just that they're long. And I feel like I would have struggled. I mean, I think I'm pretty sure I read the first one just physically, and it was a struggle for me as someone who reads slowly. So I think, once again, very similar reasons here, but honestly, it comes down to Michael Kramer and Kate Redding. They just make it for me, and I can't imagine reading these books any other way other than on audio. And if you're somebody who's used to audiobook reading and you like epic fantasy and you haven't read these on audio yet, I strongly, strongly recommend that you do. I have these on Audible because I love them and I wanted to own them, and that's the platform I use for owning audiobooks, but you absolutely could borrow these from the library. I don't think they're unscripted. I'm pretty sure that they're not, or maybe they're Audible exclusive. Are they? You know, I haven't even bothered to check because it wasn't a thought that ever crossed my mind. They're not Audible exclusive. No, I didn't think they were. So you can borrow them from the library or get them from any of the other platforms that I spoke about in that other video, part 2. But I just love them. I even actually last night was struggling to fall asleep, so I just put on The Way of Kings with my sleep headphones, which are something that I highly recommend, by the way, if you like to listen to audiobooks as you're going to sleep. I have a pair of, it's an eye mask that goes over my ears also, and there's little headphones in the ear section, so I can have the light blocked out and my headphones on and listen to my audiobook, and it's glorious and it helps me fall asleep. So I would recommend those also, even though, you know, that's not the purpose of this video. But that is it. Those are the books that I wanted to speak to you about in this slightly more advanced category, and this really was the last part of this series now. So thank you so much for watching these videos. If you've watched them all, extra thank you to you. Let me know if you have any recommendations down in the comments, and that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks. Bye.